Hi guys, so in this video I'm going to talk about TPR, or more specifically this is going to be a review of Learning Another Language Through Actions by James J. Asher. So if you don't know what TPR is, you're probably wondering what the hell am I talking about. So TPR stands for Total Physical Response. Total Physical Response is basically a language teaching technique or a language teaching method. The main characteristic of TPR and the reason why TPR is such an unusual or such a unique approach is that basically the way that you acquire a language with TPR is via commands and responding to those commands in a physical manner. For example, a teacher says to you, stand up, sit down, walk, turn around, etc. So that's the way the TPR function, and that's the way that you acquire a language using TPR. So I know it's quite an unusual and kind of weird method of learning a language. And yeah, basically a TPR lesson is extremely different from your typical language lessons. And explaining TPR is really kind of difficult, so the best way for you to understand what TPR is all about, I guess, is by watching a video in which a teacher uses TPR. So I will leave a link to a video here, so just go watch the video and return so you can understand what am I really talking about. So yes, I already mentioned that TPR is quite like an unusual method of teaching a language. However, it's extremely effective. It is extremely effective. There's actually a lot of evidence and a lot of research that support TPR, and it's considered to be one of the most researched language teaching methods out there, and a lot of people consider it like the fastest method to reach an intermediate functional level. So yeah, it's pretty much like the fastest way to start from nothing and become a functional user of the language. This book is basically the quintessential book of TPR. If you want to understand and if you want to use TPR, this is the book for you. If you're a language teacher and you're planning to use TPR, I would recommend that you first read the book and then use TPR later. So yeah, this book is really important if you want to understand what TPR is all about. You really need to read it in order to understand it and use it. So basically, this book is actually quite old. It's from the 70s, I think. Let me check. Yeah, 77. So yeah, it's quite old, but it's quite awesome. It's quite an impressive book. It's actually divided into 4 parts. The first part is called pre-TPR, and it's basically just like a background. It's like the story. Basically everything that Asher went through when he was developing TPR, and how he got interested in the whole notion of language acquisition. James Asher is a psychologist, but then he later explains to you that he became interested in language acquisition for certain reasons, and basically all the research that he did, and eventually he ended up developing TPR. He discovered that basically if you were able to understand something with just one trial, chances are that you will be able to remember that concept better than someone who required tons and tons of explanations to understand it. So he realized this, and he tried to apply that to language acquisition, and he said, well, the best way to make a piece of language, a chunk of language, understandable is with physical movements, with something that is physical, something that stand up, sit down, something that everybody can understand. We all can understand body movements such as walking and stopping and turning around. So he started to design this whole approach using physical movements and commands. So basically that's like the birth of TPR, and obviously he explains this in a lot of more detail in his book, in the first part of his book. And yeah, that's pretty much the first chapter. What I find interesting about this chapter is that it is written in first person, and that is quite bizarre or quite like unusual, but also quite interesting because basically most of the books that deal about language learning or language acquisition are written in third person and in a really rigid and serious way, but this one is actually written in first person and in quite a personal way. It's almost like an autobiography, which made it quite interesting because you're able to understand basically everything that Asher went through at those stages of developing TPR. So the second part of this book basically talks about the theories and the evidence and the research that supports TPR, and it's quite a lot. It presents you with a couple of studies that were used to develop how effective TPR was, and basically TPR was able to defeat other language approaches such as the audiolingual methods. Basically they did studies in which a group was using TPR and another bunch of groups were using audiolingual methods or other type of methods, and TPR was always like the victorious one. Also, in that part of the book, there's a couple of theories that Asher presents, or a couple of hypotheses that Asher presents, in which he tries to explain why the method works so well. The first hypothesis that James Asher makes is that basically TPR simulates the way that you learn your first language. Now, I know this phrase is so cliche nowadays. I know, for example, there's pretty much tons of language products or tons of language companies that use this motto that learn this language as you learn your first language, or learn the language the natural way, and things like that. And suddenly you believe that, and you try the product, you try the method, and suddenly you find out that there's a translation right there, or there's like a grammatical exercise, or there's something that you have to read, or a flashcard with a translation, and you're like, this is not the way that I learned my first language. And of course it isn't. But when it comes to TPR, I assure you that that is the case. TPR is pretty much like the way that you learn your L1, and it's like the closest thing that simulates the way that you learn your L1. Asher said that when we were little kids, basically 80 or 90% of the language that we received directly were commands from our parents. Things like come here, sit down, pick up the ball, pick up your toys and put them in the box. All of those commands that you received were essential for you to acquire the language. But now note that none of these commands required you to speak back. The only thing that you required to do was to answer physically. So that was an important factor for you to decipher the whole code of the language. So that's basically how you acquire your first language, and that is what TPR is trying to do, and that is one of the reasons why it works so effectively, because it's really natural. The other factor, or the other major theory that Asher talks about, is the brain lateralization theory. So this is a theory that talks that we have obviously two sides of the brain, the right side and the left, the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain, and these sides have really different functions. And when it comes to language learning, they also have a lot of different functions, because we acquire language obviously using both sides of the brain, but these both sides of the brain function in a different type of way. So basically the book presents you this whole theory and the background and how this theory applies to language acquisition, and basically it says that the right side of your brain doesn't speak. The left side of the brain is the one that speaks, but the right side of the brain deciphers the language. So when you were a little kid, you use your right side of the brain to decipher the language, and eventually when you were a little older, you started speaking using the left side of your brain. So the right side of the brain is the side that deciphers, and the left side is the side that eventually speaks. Activities such as singing, such as listening, such as enjoying a story, enjoying a movie, listening to music, all of those techniques are right side techniques. All of that help you decipher the language quite easily. Activities such as writing, speaking, reading, all of those techniques are left brain techniques. And when it comes to language acquisition, right brain, left brain, the powerful one or the fastest one is your right brain, okay? Your right brain is the part of your brain that is designed to decipher the language. And if you start to tackle language learning using right brain techniques, you are going to advance extremely fast, because that's the natural way that you were designed to decode and acquire and absorb languages. So that's a really important concept to grasp here, the whole division between right brain techniques and left brain techniques. Now, you can learn the language using left brain techniques, such as reading, such as translating, such as memorizing, dialogues and stuff like that. You can do it, but it's extremely slow, and it requires a lot of repetition and a lot of repetition. So yeah, those are like the differences between right side techniques and left side techniques. And obviously TPR basically operates almost 100% on the right side of the brain. That's the second part of the book. The third part of the book, it's basically like a big Q&A question, in which Asher basically responds to the most common or typical questions that you probably have right now about TPR, but he answers them with quite a lot of detail. He answers questions such as, what is the appropriate size of a TPR language classroom? And Asher says that, well, TPR has been tested with small classrooms, and also like small classrooms with 5 students, but also big classrooms with like 40 students, and it has worked quite well in all of them. So you can have a small classroom or a big classroom, it doesn't really matter that much. Other typical question is, when do the students will start to speak? And obviously Asher says that you should never force a student to speak, never. They will start to speak naturally eventually at one point, but a lot of people want to know what is that point, when will they start to speak. And eventually, based upon all the research and everything, they have figured out that probably after 10 hours or 12 hours of instructions, basically the students start to speak spontaneously. Now, of course, this is not perfect speech. They will make mistakes, but everything will be spontaneous, and it's not like you're forcing them, or they are not creating like this anxiety to speak the language, because you're not forcing them. They are just saying the language, they are just speaking the language without you judging them. And another common question is that, hey, I am a teacher and I want to apply TPR, but I must use like these methods. How do I switch, or how can I make the change? And Asher says that pretty much you shouldn't change abruptly. If you have students who are studying using audiolingual method or the communicative method, you shouldn't switch to TPR abruptly, like one class to another. No, you shouldn't do that. The best way to start implementing TPR is, for example, just take like 10 minutes of your class and use those 10 minutes to make some TPR activities. and that's it, and carry on with your normal class. And then progressively you start to increase the time of those TPR activities little by little by little, and eventually you will have like a class where TPR is really influential and a big part of your studying strategies. So he says that this is like the best way to start implementing. You shouldn't change, abruptly, because that might confuse your students a lot. And the fourth part of the book, which is actually the most interesting one, is in this part you actually can see certain ideas to create like your own course to using TPR to teach another language. And basically in this part you can see some classroom lessons, and this is basically what a teacher did when she was teaching English to a group of immigrants in California. Asher basically documents you what the teacher did in this 52 class course of basic English. You know, everything that she did, starting with lesson 1, all of the activities that she did, moving up to lessons 52. So yeah, he tells you everything, how she progressed, and what she taught in every single class. And of course this can serve you as a guideline for you to create your own way or your own curriculum to use TPR, and it gives you a lot of good ideas. Now that is just a guideline. That is not like the strict way that you should use TPR. It's not like just use it that way, because if you don't, it's not going to work. No, of course not. If you understand the basic principles of TPR, you can do whatever you want. But yeah, that part of the book is actually quite good because it presents you with a lot of guidelines and a lot of ideas. Now, there's a lot of ignorance surrounding TPR. There's a lot of people who criticize TPR, or a lot of people who dismiss TPR without even understanding how powerful it is or what it's capable of. So there's a lot of people that say that TPR is only useful for like basically studying simple vocabulary, and that's pretty much it. But no, there's a lot of things that you can do with TPR, a lot of things that you can teach with TPR. And that part of the book, the fourth part of the book, basically teaches you a lot of things that you can do with TPR and a lot of things that you can teach using TPR. Also a lot of activities that you can create. And there's also a lot of people that say that you cannot teach abstractions with TPR. And Asher responds to this by saying you don't really need abstractions in order to understand the linguistic code or the main structure of a language. You don't need that. You need vocabulary, simple vocabulary, and we shall introduce abstractions when you have the enough comprehension to understand abstractions by explaining them to you using the L2. So that's basically how you understood abstractions in your L1. When you were a little kid, you didn't know what government was, or you didn't know what justice or a lawsuit was. Of course not, those were really abstract things. But later, when you were a little bit older, people started to explain to you what they were, and they use obviously your L1, so that's the way that we should do it with the L2, and we should avoid using translations, of course. So yeah, you can also teach abstractions, but you should leave them at a later stage. Another thing that a lot of people say is that TPR doesn't teach you grammar, and that is false. TPR teaches you grammar as well, but the special thing is that TPR doesn't present you grammar in the obvious kind of way that, hey, let's analyze the present progressive, here we have the pronoun, and here we have the verb that ends with ing. Now everything is like more natural or more subtle. As for example, I have a student and I say to the student, hey, touch the book, and the student touches the book, and I just say, right now you are touching the book. And another example is like, hey, Anna, if Juan is touching the book, go and knock the door. And you can start to implement a lot of activities like that. Obviously, the book gives you a lot of ideas of how you can teach grammar, and actually the fourth part of the book gives you ideas of how you can teach certain verb tenses. And actually, by the end of the course presented here, the students are able to use the present tense, the present progressive, the past tense, the future tense, the conditional, and they also know regular and irregular verbs. So yeah, they actually know a lot of grammar, and you can actually teach them a lot of grammar, and the book gives you a lot of ideas of how to do it. So this is a 52 lesson course, and if you're wondering when did the students start to speak, they start to speak, okay, 52 lessons, they started to speak at lesson 5. So it was really fast actually, they started to speak quite fast. The way that the teacher started to implement the early communication or the early production activities was by role reversal, okay? So basically in a class, the teacher is the one who says the commands, and the students respond by doing the command physically. But now, in the 5th class, the teacher introduced the activity of role reversal. Now the students were going to say the commands, and the teacher was going to do the commands. And this is actually quite impressive, and it's actually quite smart, because the students start to produce the language, the students start to speak the language, but they are so thrilled by the whole idea of manipulating the teacher that they completely forget that they are speaking in another language. And that is a sign of good teaching, because they are not stressed, they don't have the anxiety, they don't feel like they are forced to speak the language. No, they are just so thrilled by the whole idea of manipulating the teacher, and they are just having fun that they don't really realize that, oh my god, I'm speaking another language. They are just having fun. So that is quite amazing, and that's like the first activity that this teacher did in order to introduce early production in the language, and that's how it started. So yeah, I really recommend this book if you are interested in languages, language acquisition, or if you're a language teacher, because there's a lot of important things that you should know about. And again, if you're a teacher, I would recommend you, if you want to use TPR, I recommend you that you first read this book and then you use TPR, because you really need to understand a lot of details about TPR in order to use it. Another important thing that everyone needs to understand is that, even Asher says this, TPR is not a panacea. He says that TPR is probably the best linguistic tool that you have out there, but it's not the only one, and you shouldn't use it as the only tool. You know, it's an extremely good, effective tool, but you have to combine it with other methods. You shouldn't use it as your only method, because it's not going to work quite well. You should combine it. It's probably the best method out there, but you must combine it. You shouldn't use it just alone. Okay? So that's also another detail that you have to keep in mind. So if you're a teacher, read this book first. Okay? There's a lot of books about TPR, but you should start with this one. Okay? And there's actually a sequel of this book of Learning Another Language Interactions. It wasn't written by James Asher. It was written by Ramiro Garcia. The book is called Instructor's Notebook: How to Apply TPR for Results, and you should check one as well. It basically tells you how to use TPR in a broader way, but you first have to understand what is written in this first book. And yeah, that's eventually all. I really recommend this book to every language enthusiasts out there. And yes, I'm also like working in a project that also involves quite a lot of TPR. So that's pretty much all for now, and see you later.